Please feel free, if you wish to ask a question, type your question into the chat button in the middle bottom of your screen. There's an icon that says chat. As the moderator, I will monitor the chat box and present questions to Michael as appropriate. We may not be able to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. The best way to view this presentation is by using the speaker side-by-side view. The speaker view button is in your upper right-hand corner of the screen. And finally, if you have any technical questions during this workshop, please go back to the event homepage and a technical person is available to assist you. And now it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Michael Durschlag. Michael is the director of Pease Academy, Peers Enjoying a Sober Education. It is the longest running sober recovery school in the United States. Michael began working at Pease in 1995 as the social studies teacher. He became the director in 2007. He is a licensed 7 through 12 social studies teacher and earned his master's in teaching from the University of St. Thomas in 2002. Michael also holds a BA in Religious Studies from Beloit College. Michael's commitment to recovery schools goes beyond Pease Academy, as he also serves as part of the MCTC's Minnesota Community and Technical Colleges Advisory Board and the Collegiate Recovery Program, and as an advisor on the Coalition of Recovery Investments and vice chairperson of the Association of Recovery Schools and is part of their executive council. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Michael Durschlag.
Thank you, Sherry. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. It's always the big question with Zoom. Sherry, am I good? Okay, perfect. So I just, welcome to Adolescent Drug Use Trends and Challenges. This is a presentation that I have made both to family groups, community groups, and professional groups over the last couple of years, because I believe it provides us a really good framework to start looking at adolescent substance use. Here's my information, and I am available for the community to always reach out and ask me questions. I've been working in this field, both in education and recovery, for a little over 25 years. And so over those years, I've been able to make some very good connections throughout the community, within the state, and also nationally. So I always encourage people, if questions comes up, if concerns come up about either adolescents or other loved ones, please feel free to reach out and ask questions, or just sometimes it's just nice to have someone to talk with as you kind of walk through this. Substance use and substance use disorder just aren't easy topics to talk about, nor are they easy to walk through if it's a loved one that is experiencing it. So today, my hope is that for everybody here, that I'll be able to provide a framework for both parents and professionals to use when addressing adolescent substance use. And more important, the ability to use the continuum of use framework to be able to have some meaningful conversations with young people as their caregivers. And then hopefully we can use, throughout the presentation, I'll provide strategies to everybody to use to address the different levels of adolescent substance use. So just a little bit about who I am. You got a little short bio about a little bit of my work, both at Pease Academy, which is a recovery high school serving young people who are in recovery from substance use disorder. About 80% of our students also have co-occurring diagnoses. And we've recognized that for a long time, that it's not just substance use, but substance use and some mental wellness health issues do walk hand in hand. And so we provide supports around that. But that's just the professional side. And I've mentioned that I've been involved nationally and also locally with trying to provide a continuum of care for people after they leave treatment. Treatment is a phenomenal initial intervention. It oftentimes starts or restarts the process of recovery, but it's really important like what kind of supports we have around people once they get that initial medical attention. And that's really kind of where my expertise and my focus has been for the past 25 years. And for young people who are under the age of 18, really recovery high schools and is really kind of about it when it comes to that continuum of care. They don't have the same options and opportunities as adults do. And we can talk more about that. But beyond the professional side, you know, I'm also a father of 2 teenagers. I never thought that that I would be. I used to think when my kids got to be teenagers, it might be time for me to move on from Pease Academy, because I always thought I would need a break from adolescents, teenagers, from work and home. But that has not been the case. I have a 14-year-old daughter who's about to be 15 on Tuesday. And I also have a 17-year-old son who's a senior in high school. So I have a first-year student in high school and a last-year student in high school. And I'll be referring to both of them throughout this presentation because it's always nice to have kind of that personal connection. And I've used the framework that I've been using with them. And I always let them know that there is me, the professional, that we can talk about this, but there's also me, the dad side. And so I try to differentiate kind of the where I'm talking from when we're in discussions. I also want to let you know that I always think this is a pretty difficult conversation to have, and this is a difficult presentation to walk through. And I think one of the reasons why is that most of us have not been, most of us, when I'm in a room full of people, the majority of the people, if not all the people, have been impacted by substance use disorder in one way or another. And so oftentimes, the hurt, the pain, the concern, the worry, it's right beneath the surface. And so sometimes talking about these things can be difficult and hard. The other part about it is that I just want to make sure that everybody understands is that I'm looking this at how to look at adolescents. When I work with the students here at Pease Academy and I work with my own children, I try to be as non-judgmental as possible. I don't know where someone is when we get to the continuum where they are. I'm not, if someone says, well, I'm over here, it's not, in no way is it a judgment upon their use. It's just kind of one of those difficult things. I remember being back at my alma mater, Beloit College, about 5-7 years ago for a reunion, and we were out and about, and the wife of one of my friends from college asked me, after knowing what I did professionally, said, you must kind of look at these people with kind of a raised eyebrow or whatever. And I said, actually, I really don't, because one, this is circumstantial, and B, I don't know anything about their substance use besides the moment that we're in right now. So I always try to look at this as this, not coming from a judgmental, but it just provides a framework for people to maybe look at I don't always say look at adolescence in general. So this is the continuum of use that I use. And it's really, really helpful because it provides a framework for us to really start looking at substance use, especially in regards to adolescents. And I'm going to kind of walk through this and provide different ideas and thoughts around each one. I know it looks like a straight line that has an arrow at the end, but what I also want to say that that's just my lack of artistic skills. It's a lot more circular in nature. That it's not just you kind of move from one all the way to the other, and hopefully that becomes clearer as we kind of walk through this. Again, if there's any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to ask. I'd be more than happy to do my best to answer them along the way. So as a father, I have started having conversations with my children at a fairly young age. One of the reasons why I've had these conversations with my own children at a very young age is because, and I did not say this when I talked a little bit about myself, I am a person in long-term recovery. And so I wanted to make sure that they knew where I was going at night when I was going to community-based recovery support networks outside the home. I also wanted to let them know that they too, there's a possibility that they have a genetic predisposition to substance use disorder. And in my family unit, they also had a predisposition to mental health issues. And so I thought it was important for them to know, and the different, how those conversations occurred as they grew up. It changed. For example, when both my children were kind of going into that middle of elementary school, I started talking to them about, that they might have friends who start introducing them to different substances. And what I needed to let them know is that peer pressure isn't always the case of someone saying, hey, use this, use this, use this. It oftentimes is that they're with a group of friends or a friend, and that friend pulls something out, and they don't want to feel awkward or not, or say no, and so they just go along with it. And I just remember, and I said, it could be your best friend. And I remember talking with my son about this, and he looked at me with very sorrowful eyes, and he asked, do you mean Davis? And that was his best friend at the time. And I said, well, it might be, I don't know. But it's just kind of one of those conversations that we've had since they've been very young. And I just, so the hope as a parent. Yep.
I have a question
Sure.
that popped up. There's this theory that some people do not want to address the question because they're worried that it might plant the idea. Could you address that? Do you feel that's true?
There is some research that shows that is a possibility. And a lot of that possibility a lot of that research and information comes out of the DARE program. It used to be very popular in the schools. Because here you have a group of some professionals coming in and talking about specific drugs and what it might do to your body. And it did, and it planted the seed about, oh, that sounds fun, that sounds interesting, that's intriguing. And Dr. Lee at Hazelden, who's he's written some phenomenal books. He talks about this gene for risk taking and factor. And so, they see that as such a possible risk, and they want to possibly engage in it. My take on that, though, is it's how you talk about it and what you and the subject matters you're bringing up, and their ages, because they are talking about at school. It is, especially if you have they have friends who have older siblings, and I don't necessarily talk about what each substance does, or oh, if you smoke pot, this is this. It's just like, it's more about, as you grow up, you may be exposed to certain substances, or people might ask you to use. And one of the things I said is, like, how I always framed it, and how I continue, you're going to be faced with choices throughout your life. And one of the things you always have to ask yourself is the choice I'm making helpful to where I want to go, or is it something that, it's all about these choices. And when I have these conversations with my son and my daughter, it's not necessarily that I'm having don't do this. I do certainly have been setting my expectations as they get older. But yeah, so I don't think it's wrong, because I think they're hearing it outside. And if you start the conversations and come at it for a while, that when they are actually exposed to it, it's not something that's an awkward conversation, that it's out of left field, and they're feeling more and more comfortable with having that. Jumping ahead a little bit,
Michael, one more
Sure.
statement. For
Sure.
some reason, we're not seeing your picture on the screen. So we're seeing your slides, but we're not seeing your picture. So
See, like my actual face?
Yes, you might need to adjust your speaker view in the upper corner to go to speaker view.
Well, that's interesting. So let me, I probably have to stop my presentation.
No, this is Chad with Allied. You're good. Every person that is watching the presentation needs to go into their gallery view and select speaker. It's the participant that needs to do it. There's nothing you can do as a presenter on that end.
Okay.
Yep.
Chad, I'm doing that and it's not working for me.
So go to view,
Yes.
select gallery.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Well, and now that you can see me, like, oh, maybe that wasn't a great idea. I've been told that I have a face for radio. Just so. Unfortunately, I probably don't have the voice for radio. So, so for example, like, I have had these conversations, and so when my son was in 10th grade, or was it beginning of 11th grade? Sorry. He was about to ask, or he asked this young woman out to one of the dances was coming up at his high school. And I said, and I'd asked him previously, have you been exposed to it? He's like, well, I have some friends who've used it, but I haven't yet. And so we've had some conversations, and I asked him about this girl because I didn't know who she was. I said, does she smoke pot? And he said, she has a couple times. And then I looked at him, I'm like, well, she tried to smoke pot with you. And he said, no, Dad, she's not. That's not who she is. I'm like, okay, I just want to make sure. And then I looked at him, I'm like, have you smoked pot? And he breathed and he says, yes, I have. And I was like, okay, well, thanks for being honest with me. I really appreciate that. Now, my hope for my son and the hope for my daughter is that that they would stay in this no use or abstinence realm, right? That is my hope. And that's my hope for any adolescent. It just truly is. The research out there shows that as we can delay that first use, every year we delay that first use, their chances of developing a substance use disorder or addiction, or however you want to call it, but their chances of developing a substance use disorder, it goes down every single year. And and I used to hear this, when the states switched from 18-year-old drinking to 19-year-old drinking, and then to 20-year-old, 21-year-old drinking, I used to really think, and I still think it was this way, I thought it was kind of this arbitrary age. Because you talk to a high school student, they're like, what's the difference between an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old? And in their mind, there's really nothing much different. And I understand when they went to 18 and 19, because 18-year-olds still in high school and they're probably exposing other high school students as well. And when you got to the 19-year-olds are still hanging out with 18-year-olds, are still hanging out with younger students. But there's a lot of research now that shows if we can delay substance use until that 21, their chances of developing a substance use disorder goes down to almost nothing. And that doesn't mean they won't, but it also means that the chances are become very, very slim, and they've kind of gotten out of that. The other part about adolescence, as we all probably know, it's when we're really developing all those different skills in terms of social skills, how to interact with one another. And one of the battles that I have in my school is how do we reteach young people how to have those social skills without substance use? Because once someone introduces substance use into their social situation, and that becomes more and more normal, that is how all social skills are kind of wrapped around. For example, no longer does it take time and effort and awkwardness to build friendships with one another. You smoke a joint with someone the first time, and you're good. And so the more we can delay that use, the better. And I want my daughter and I want my son to have those opportunities to really build those skills that'll help them in the future and also in the current. So my hope for everybody is no use and abstinence. But the Just Say No era of Reagan, if people remember that, I certainly do, doesn't work. It didn't work. I always encourage families to set expectations, right? The expectation in my house is that my kids will not use. And as I just kind of shared, so far I'm 0 for 1. Well, I guess my daughter hasn't used yet, from what I know. We still have these conversations, and I believe we've set up a situation where they feel comfortable and to be honest with us. And I'll kind of talk more about that a little bit. So no use abstinence. The other good thing about this is, even if you get farther down along the spectrum and enter into full-blown substance use disorder, you can always return to no use and abstinence. I am living proof of that, right? And there's millions of people around the world that are living proof that even if someone does develop a substance use disorder, they can, with the right kind of structures and support, they can return to no use and abstinence. The next stage on this is experimental, and experimental is probably the most overused term there is when it comes to adolescent substance use. It's one that I hear over and over again, and I can completely understand and empathize with a parent or a teacher or professional when they say, well, this person or that Jane is just experimenting. It minimizes the use. This is my baby, this is my son. I don't want to necessarily know everything that's going on. Well, I do, but that I always like to think the best of my child. I like to think of the best of my children. And experimental, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten a phone call. Yeah, I'm just calling because I'm concerned, and I know my child is experimenting. And frequently I just let it go. But if I'm working with someone a little more closely, this is how I experiment. An experiment is, I don't know what this substance does to me. I don't know what it is like to drink a beer. I drink a beer. I now know what a beer does to me. Experiment is over. I could go further and say, I don't know what it is to be drunk, but once I get drunk, the experiment is over. I frequently hear experimenting when it comes to marijuana. My son or my daughter is experimenting with marijuana. What should I do? And I said, well, what does that mean by experimenting? And usually say, well, they're using periodically. I'm like, well, that sounds like they're using periodically. It's not an experiment. Once I know what smoking marijuana does to me in terms of how it makes me feel, how it makes me show up in life, I am no longer experimenting anymore. And I think there's a distinction, because if we're talking, it just takes some of the judgment away about what use is. Because when I'm even working with young people, students are like, well, I relapsed, because that's the term they use, or I've had a reoccurrence of use. And I said, what is it? So you used once? Well, like, no, I've relapsed a few times. And I was like, well, it sounds like you've relapsed and you've continued to use. And they always say, well, I'm not using that much. So no one ever said about much, right? We just know that you're continuing to use. And it's the same thing. My son is not experimenting. He knows what marijuana does to him. Now, if we come all the way down this end spectrum and I could have a full-blown substance use disorder that's diagnosed with a DSM-V5, and that's the kind of diagnostic tool that professionals use to kind of determine where someone is on this continuum of use. I can still be in the experimental zone, even if I have a full-blown substance use disorder. What that means is this: I could have a full-blown substance use disorder where I'm smoking pot chronically, I'm drinking frequently, and the first time I use heroin, I experimented. I don't know what heroin does to me. Most people don't start off, go from abstinence straight to heroin. Right? That's just not usually how this goes. So they're usually, someone who's using heroin is usually much further down this continuum of use than someone who picks up marijuana the first time. That's not 100%, but it's awfully darn close. The other part of experimenting is I can be in kind of inappropriate, harmful use area and still have still experiment for what that substance might do. For example, I know what marijuana does to me. The first time I show up to school high is an experiment. right? I don't know what it's like to be high in school. Once I know what it's like to be high in school, experiment over. Is that kind of, I'm since the questions, that's kind of where experimental, kind of when I think of experimental, it's that first time I now know what it means and I can move forward.
Michael,
Yep.
we have a question.
Oh, good.
What do you do if your child is not honest with you? You know there's a problem, you approach them and you get the typical, nah, that's not true. What's the next step?
Well, I would want to know what the evidence is. Are we looking at certain behaviors? And I know that someone probably asked that question and they might not be able to respond right away, but I want to know what the behaviors are leading me to that. Do I have evidence? I mean, are they coming home smelling like alcohol? Are they coming home, glassy eyed? And I also know that my son is probably minimizing. I know my son is minimizing his use. I know that when I talk to people, they're usually minimizing what they're doing. One of the things that we can always do is like, well, you know what? These are my suspicions, and this is why. I understand. Nope. And not to get into an argument about what they're doing. No, that's fine. Here, I bought this at Walgreens. Can you give me a urinary analysis? You know what? We're going to go we're going to just take a ride. Where are we going, Dad? We're going to go to a place called Minnesota Monitoring, and I'm going to have them do a full screen UA on you. I'm worried. As your dad, that's my job. I'm worried. I just want to know. I'm not, and even if it comes back positive for all these things, you're not in trouble. I just want to know because I want to know what those next steps might be. So I'd want the evidence and then, if it kind of went from there and they're like, oh my gosh, look at these substances in your urine, son, or look at the levels of your THC. This isn't someone who's just smoking pot every couple weeks. This is someone who's smoking pretty regularly, or whatever. I'm like, you know what? I don't know the answers. I'd like to get a medical expert's suggestions. Well, what's that? Let's find an assessment, a chemical health assessment. And in the resource page that I provided, there's ways to get different chemical health assessments. In Minnesota, we have even if people don't have insurance, we have what's called Rule 25. And then we'll kind of get into where areas I don't know. So getting an assessment, and usually people are like, well, I don't want to get it. It's just like, we're just going to find out and we'll make a plan after that. You're a big part of that plan. So whatever I can do to get all the information on the table. Once I have as much information, then we can start moving. Is it impacting their life? Are they missing school? Do I see grades dropping? Do I see their friend groups changing? Is this where they want to be going in life? And like, these are all questions they can maybe answer. Is like, what, so if you're not using, why have your grades been dropping the last the last month? Why am I getting more class you're skipping school? Why are you absent? You're feeling sick more. These are the reasons why I, as your father, want to go this step and see what's really going on. And my hope is we can take use off the table and we can start talking about the behaviors. I hope I answered that question. So then this next category, I'm really hesitant to ever bring up, even when I go into the schools and I bring a group of students up from Pease Academy to another high school, and we talk about the socially acceptable use. I'm always hesitant, or I express hesitancy. I don't know if I'm really that hesitant, because the reality is that for adolescents, there is no socially acceptable use. They don't see it that way. That's why I talk about it. Everything they use is illegal, right? They cannot drink legally. Even if they lived in Colorado, they could not smoke pot legally. If they're using a prescription pill that's not theirs or how it's prescribed, it's not legal. So everything they are doing is socially unacceptable. It's illegal. Now, when I'm talking with people, I'm like, I understand. What's the difference between a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old and a 21-year-old? I don't know. And so how I describe socially acceptable use is where I hope my son is. And we've talked about that. It's just like, and I'm going to use it as an adult because it's hard for me to talk about it in terms of an adolescent first. So socially acceptable use is if I am out to dinner with my wife and we both enjoy a glass of wine. It's a socially appropriate time. We use a socially appropriate amount. Another socially acceptable use is if it's Sunday right now. It's Sunday and football is about to start, and I get together with a few friends and we're watching football, we're eating chicken wings, and we drink a few beers over the course of a game. Right? No one's gonna, and I don't get in my car and drive, right? Everything is safe, and it's socially acceptable use at a socially acceptable time. If I lived in Colorado or one of the other states where marijuana is legal, and if I go to a rock and roll concert or a blues concert, whatever kind of concert, and I smoke a little pot, that is a socially acceptable time and place to use. So for an adolescent, what socially acceptable use of pot is might be if they're at a party and they use a little something, right? If they decide to go to a movie and maybe I'll just continue to use pot because it's probably the most it's very damaging to the adolescent development of the brain. It's very damaging to the development of an adolescent brain. But if they're going to go to a movie on a Friday night and they smoke a joint in the parking lot before they go in the movie, that would probably be social acceptable use. What I have conversations with my son about is whether or not that is how they're watching movies all the time. Is the majority of the time that you're going to see a movie, now he doesn't go see a lot of movies, but are you smoking? When you get together with your friends, is what's common, or is it uncommon that you're using, right? I'm trying to gauge how much they're using, and this past fall 2019, we were driving to me and him were driving together down to Wisconsin to go take his first college tour. And I always like to have conversations with my son or my daughter when we're walking, when we're driving, somewhere where we're not we're not kind of face to face to each other. That way it's not as confrontational, or seems to be as confrontational. And we're kind of talking about this, and I'm trying to gauge how much he's using. And I'm expressing to him about, hey, that you've got to remember that use is always going to be fun at first, even if you develop a substance use disorder. And most people don't have a horrible time and they can just continue to use. But you have a predisposition to substance use disorder, son, because of me, and you just have to be very, very careful around this. And I was like, and here's the thing, it's not just a genetic predisposition, there's an environmental factor to it. And he's like, what do you mean, Dad? I was like, well, the environmental factor is a lot of people who have a substance use disorder also have experienced some sort of trauma in their life as well. Not across the board, right? And he's like, trauma? Like what? What do you mean trauma, right? And I was like, oh, maybe he's never had, he's had a pretty decent life so far. And not that he didn't, but I was like, well, sometimes trauma shows up as if they've experienced violence in their household or violence in their neighborhood, in their community. And sometimes that violence, that experience and exposure to violence can cause trauma. He's like, oh. And I was like, or sometimes someone is sexualized at a very young age or molested, right? And so I kind of walked through. He's like, oh, Dad, I haven't had any of, and gave some other examples. We haven't had any of that. And as we continue to talk, what I said was like, Oscar, it sounds like what you're telling me is that in a very real way that it's social use at this point. And what I can also say is that it is completely and totally normal if you didn't use. And he looked at me, he's like, what? No, everybody uses, Dad. I'm like, oh goodness, no, not everybody does. He's like, everybody I know uses. I'm like, yeah, and that's part of an issue. He's like, well, there's a couple people who don't. I was like, we have this worldview, the students have this idea that everybody uses, and that's part of that peer pressure. Well, if everybody's using it, if I don't use, I'm the one who's left out. And when I throw out the statistics, sometimes people are like, well, that's so low or that's so high. It kind of all depends on your perspective. So Oscar, 47% of all high schoolers. He's like, well, not at my high school, Dad. I'm like, those percentages are probably pretty close. I mean, you might waver by a few percentages based on your high school. I was like, 47% of all high school students have never used anything, haven't had a glass of wine, haven't drank a beer. He's like, really? I'm like, that's true. Have never used anything. It's who your social circle is with. But if you were to step outside your social circle and see what some of those other students are doing, they don't use. They have a very different perspective of who's using it, who wants. So that's socially acceptable use. Kind of socially acceptable time and acceptable places. For example, even when I was at that college reunion and there might have been a couple of people who were drunk, it's time for me to go home. That may have been inappropriate use of that substance, right? Because they had too much to drink. However, it was socially acceptable given the circumstances. It was a college reunion. It doesn't mean it wasn't inappropriate or harmful or potentially abusive. It just was what it was. I had a good friend of mine, one of my best friends, reach out to me a few years ago, and she was concerned about her substance use, her drinking. She was working way too much. She was on the road a lot, and she was going through a divorce. And as we talked, I was like, no, I don't know. And it was go to the end of this, kind of that internal struggle with it. I was like, I don't know. And we just started brainstorming different ways, different things that she could do to unwind and relax after a long day of work when she was on the road. And she was ready to say, well, I got to stop drinking. And I'm like, there's never anything wrong with not drinking. But as she kind of walked through it, she found out, and we continued to have conversations that she wasn't kind of in the abuse or substance use disorder. So socially acceptable use. Inappropriate or harmful use is when we start using in times that aren't appropriate or in ways that aren't appropriate. If I was to ever show up to school, or show up to work under the influence, it would be considered an inappropriate time, and people would say, Mike, you have a problem. And when I work with high schools in Minnesota, it's only been in Minnesota, how frequently do they have students who are in the school that are under the influence and nothing is done, or very little is done? If a young person is showing up to school, and if they are high, even if it's their first time that's high, it means that use is creeping into their life in a way that we would never want it to creep into anyone's life. Prior to coming to Pease Academy, when I was working at a high school that will go unnamed, a young man, a ninth grader, walked into my civics class, and he was incredibly high. Eyes red, glassed over, just cheesy grin. And I was new, and I asked my mentor teacher, what do we do? And she said, unless it falls out of his pocket, nothing. I said, well, that doesn't seem right. She's like, well, what are we supposed to do? I'm like, well, we're supposed to address it. And I brought it up to him. I was like, I couldn't help but notice that yesterday when you showed up to my class that you were pretty high. And he got very defensive. And I was like, there's no way for me to say yes or no. I just want you to know that I did notice, and B, that I like when you're in class and you're not high. It was just concern. I just shared with it. I couldn't get in an argument with them because, of course, there was nothing for me to do. But to let it go and to address it was probably going to cause more damage. So inappropriate, harmful use, when it starts becoming more and more part of their life, or they're using it in different ways. One of the things that I like is that this idea is that as a family, if a line or a boundary is crossed, then there is a consequence, right? That if my son brings something into my house, let me step back, that doesn't sound right. If my son brings something into our house, right? It's not my house, but our house, he is putting me at risk. He knows that. We've had that conversation. That's a line that is drawn. If that happens, or if his friends do, there will be a consequence, and he knows that that's that consequence, what that consequence is. If he drives under the influence, there is a consequence, right? When he comes in at night and he's under the influence, and he's been driving, there's going to have to be a consequence. My hope is that consequence is fair, but is strong enough that if when facing that similar situation, he's like, that wasn't worth it.
Michael, we have a question.
Right.
What is your feeling on contracts about use, and are they effective? Are they worth doing?
I love them. I really do. I always try to have conversations and contracts, and I encourage my families that I work with at Pizza Cafe to have those conversations, not in the heat of the moment. Set up those contracts when things are kind of good and calm. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations here at work with those students where I've set them up with contracts. Okay, yep, you want to stop using because we're an abstinence-based program. These are the supports you're going to do. Wonderful. What should we do? Like, I'll ask questions so the person I'm working with can kind of buy into all of it. So what should we do is if you continue to use? When you really want to stop, what does it mean if you continue to use, even though you're committed to not using this? And they're like, well, I think if that happens, I should probably go get an assessment and follow through the recommendations. I'm like, okay, that's wonderful. We'll write it up. They can sign it. Because once, and I can't tell you how many times they're like, they said, oh, they used again, or they continue to use. They're like, well, I don't want to get an assessment. I don't want to go to treatment. I'm like, whoa. This is something you agreed to. If we were going to renegotiate this contract, this is not the time to do it. The time to renegotiate contracts is when there's not an issue at hand. Right. So, my son knows, and it's not necessarily a contract. My son knows what's at stake. He knows what's at stake. He loves his school. He loves his job. He has a great job. He's doing really well at school, and he knows what's at stake. He knows that he'll lose his school and he'll lose his job if things get out of control. And so far, and that's kind of the end of the road, not the end of the road because it can certainly go farther, but he knows, and he's like, what, I'm going to come to Pizza Academy? I'm like, oh no, I can't have you at Pizza Academy. That just wouldn't work. I'm going to have to send you out to White Bear Lake to my friends Beth and Tracy at Insight. And I was like, that's a school about 15. And he's like, and we had that conversation. I was like, Oscar, I'm not going to spend all that money on treatment just to allow you to walk back into your high school. Because 98% of all high school students, their first day back from treatment are offered drugs their first day back at school. And that comes from NIDA, National Institute of Drug, whatever the A stands for. Right? 98%. I can't set you up for that. That's my job as a father. I also know that I love that you work at that restaurant. I think it's a phenomenal place for you to work. You're making great money. You're able to support yourself. But I also know that there are people there, including your friends, who do use. I can't send you back into that lion's den. One of the ways I know that my son is probably still in that socially acceptable use is how he spends his money. Right? Someone is not into abuse and substance use disorder and goes out and spends $30 on deodorant. Heck, I don't spend $30 on deodorant, but my son just spent $30 on Chanel deodorant. And my wife's kind of like, what? I'm like, honey, this is kind of a good thing. This is kind of allows him to know, or allows us to know that his money is going to frivolous things that aren't drugs. So anyways, a little side note. So inappropriate, harmful use, that is when it's creeping in. When it's starting to get into abuse is when those consequences aren't enough. that it doesn't matter what we say. He will do what he wants to do, or she will do what she wants to do. That it was just bad luck. Oh, you know what? That DWI, for many people who get DWIs, driving while under the influence, it's just a one-time deal. They made a poor choice. They drank, they got in the back, they're in their car, they get pulled over. The cost of that, and they're like, oh my gosh, that was such a bad choice. I will never, it doesn't mean they won't drink again. It just means I won't drive when I'm drinking. End of story. And a lot of people do that. People who are abusive drinkers, problematic drinkers, it was just bad luck. I'll be safer next time. I won't drink whiskey. I'll just drink vodka. I won't leave at bar time. I'll make sure my headlights are turned on. Whatever that is, they'll just, they'll come up with excuses why it was just bad luck to have it, what kind of happened. Abuse, becomes more frequent, that it's not just, it's not just 3 or 4 beers when I'm with my friends watching football. It becomes 12 beers every time I'm watching football. Matter of fact, watching football is now becoming more of an excuse of me to drink and less about the game and the camaraderie. And that's starting to become internal ups, kind of between the ears, brain stuff. Like what is my relationship with substances? When I go into the schools and I work with high school students that are, not necessarily my own, I look at them, I'm like, people start getting preoccupied with use. And they're like, well, and they kind of look at me quizzically. I'm like, for example, there may be someone in this room right now who's really looking forward to the end of the day so they can use with their buddies. You're thinking about use before you actually get there. I'm going to go to this party because I think there's going to be something there. And if that's not there, I'm going to be disappointed. It becomes more and more of our focal point. That's when we're really moving down this line. If I'm at work and I'm like, oh, I can't wait till this weekend hits because I'm just going to kick back and just go on a bender. This weekend and Monday, just put everything aside. I'm thinking about it more and more and more. My sister once described it. She said, Mike, I show up at parties and there may be something there. There may not be something there. And if there's nothing there, there's nothing there. And this was when we were in high school. She said, and if there's something there, I may or may not use it. I was like, really? That's just a different approach that I have when going there. And this is, of course, in hindsight, but I was just like, oh man, I'd be mad if I was thinking there's something there and there wasn't there. And if it was there, I'm certainly going to use it. It's started becoming preoccupation. And somewhere along that line, people develop a dependence upon it. And dependence it's not only a physical dependence. And yes, that old adage that marijuana is not addictive, that is not true. It was addictive back in the 80s, and it's just been getting more and more strong. But marijuana is addictive and you can see that physiologically there's a withdrawal. It's not the same kind of withdrawal as heroin, but there's a physiological withdrawal, and people can see it and they can feel it. But so substance use, it's a physical dependence on that substance, but it's also a very pronounced obsession around it and compulsion. Using during times you shouldn't be using. Oh my gosh, I'm about to go to synagogue. Now is not the time to use. Well, maybe just a little bit will be okay. And so, and there's an arrow. I can't see it on my screen because the presenter's there, but there's arrows there. This will continue to go, and the disease of substance use disorder is progressive, and frequently it's fatal. Yep, 10 minutes. I was just thinking that too. So, so that's really kind of, and like I said, we can always intervene anywhere along this line. This is just some of the same things in this from last year. I don't have obviously this year. Just kind of so you're aware of what young people are using. And this is the problem with substance use. Once you open up the door to one substance, you open up your door to being exposed to other substances as well. Right? This is the conversations I have with my son. I know it just sounds like you're smoking, and yes, you've had a beer or two, but I'm actually very, very worried about liquid marijuana in vaping THC. And I explain why that is, and that's taken almost a very harm reduction approach when it comes to him. I know you're smoking. I don't want you smoking liquid forms of THC. Why, Dad? And I can explain why, because we don't know what we're getting. It's highly dangerous. It's high concentration. You never know the concentration, and it can lead to this, this, and this. And it doesn't mean every time, right? But these are potentials. And prescription pills, I am deathly afraid of for him. Because unless he's picking it up at a pharmacy, which he's not, most often it's coming from the dark web, which it could be, which is an illegal market where they're not even being created in the lab of the actual provider. And I was like, Oscar, you and 3 friends could all take something from the same batch, and you will get the one that has that deadly dose of all of a sudden the name of it just went off my out of my head, so that's okay. The highly toxic synthetic opiate. So it'll come back to me. Anyways, so those are, that's just kind of what students our Pease Academy students are using. Again, just another way to look at it, primaries and tertiaries, besides, because most people aren't single substance users. And usually as people kind of moved on along that continuum, students do use. And then here's just kind of.
Michael, we have a question.
Great.
Are there any studies about use during the quarantine?
I think it's a little early. I have not seen any actual studies. I know that overdoses and deaths have gone up. That I do know. I would assume that substance use has gone up as well. So, and here's the odd thing. I'll just kind of say, it's in the substance use source. So all of these things can be seen in kind of the when you go back and look at the screen, so you can kind of look through it. I was actually one of the advocates at a few forums about when they're talking about essential businesses. I said, you know what, liquor stores have to be open. And people are like, what? Why? And I was like, well, because it's not for you and me to be able to buy bottles of wine and enjoy with dinner. It's for the chronic alcoholic that if they withdraw off alcohol, there's a potential they'll die. There's only 2 substances that just cold turkey withdrawal will come from, will actually potentially kill you, and you need medical attention when coming off of it, and that's alcohol and benzodiazepines, which is Xanax. And Xanax is or bars is another way people have seen Xans, are very popular with younger people and were very easy to get from the doctor's office. So that's about 5 minutes. If there are any questions in the last 5 minutes, I'm more than happy to take any questions or comments. And hopefully people see that screen, that you can see my email and my phone number. If you call that phone number right now, it goes straight to it actually gets routed to my cell phone. So my cell phone's on the first or second slide, but but you can always call just my office phone number. And like I said, it gets routed to my cell phone. So.
I don't see any other questions. Oh, let's see. I see Karen. I see hand raised. Let's see if I can. Karen, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question? The mute button is in the bottom left
There
side.
we go. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My wonderment is, to what degree should a youngster who's dipping into either meth, or even I hear it can be put on pot or marijuana, fentanyl, to what degree is that high risk?
If I heard your question correctly, if someone is just getting into meth or even marijuana, what's the risk of fentanyl? That's the drug that I couldn't think of. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
What's the risk of being exposed to that? I would say with meth a lot higher. I know that, and also cocaine. And I used to think, why would anyone cut any of that with fentanyl? It makes no sense.
Exactly.
It seems like you're killing your customers. And what I found out when I asked that question, because I asked that same question a couple of years ago, what it does, it creates a different kind of physical dependence on that substance. And so the hope is you're not as a dealer, you're not killing the person, but you're creating an unknown dependence upon it, that you really kind of go through opiate withdrawal, which makes you really, really sick. And then, if you use it, it's going to make you feel better and take the sickness away. And so that's the reason why they cut it. So with meth, I think it would be a much higher chance of doing that. I asked it because there's been few articles about it being in marijuana. And I asked that, and the answer that I got, they're like, the research at this point does not show that would have any impact on someone who smoked. And now this is if it was like a marijuana bud, like the true plant. And I was like, and they're like, it burns at 2 different levels. And so the heat of marijuana burns at a much lower level than you would have to burn the fentanyl. So that you wouldn't be getting the dying of the dosage of fentanyl. Whether that is true, whether or not, it's true. I believe the scientist, the pharmacology person who kind of shared this, he's kind of the expert in that stuff. I just want to mess around. I think when we move into the liquid forms of THC, the risk gets higher. Especially since who knows where you're buying it from.
I guess the other part of my question is, to what degree do you see this risk out in the community?
I see fentanyl being a risk in the prescription pills. That's the biggest risk we have.
Oh, more than meth. Is that correct?
Oh goodness, yes, a lot more than meth.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to wrap up before we
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps we can connect
Thank you.
afterwards. But I want to thank Michael so much for this timely and very important presentation. And I want to thank all of you for your participation. Please fill out the evaluation to let us know how things went today and how things can be improved. We very much appreciate it. And if you complete an evaluation, you will be entered for a prize. So we appreciate that. And just a reminder that the handout is on the JFCS website under the tab marked handouts. And if you wish to view any other workshops, this one or any other one, they will be available for 60 days. So thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Michael.
Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate it. Thank you for everybody who showed up. Feel free to reach out with any other questions.
Okay. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the conference.